you, all of you who are here, and also those who are participating online. It is a blessing, as usual. Let's turn our Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 12. And today we will start off on verse 44 and go all the way to chapter 13, verse 3. We took a break last week. Bob blessed us with a banquet. And now we go back to the usual mundane, hearty food, but not a banquet. But you can't live on banquets every day, right? You do it, can you? Again, Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 44 to Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 3. I'll read and you can follow along. And at the same time, some were appointed over the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings, the first fruits, the tithes, to gather them from the fields of the city, the portion specified by the law, for the priests and the Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who ministered. Both the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of the purification, according to the commandment of David and Solomon his son. For in the days of David and Asaph of old, there were chiefs of the singers and songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. In the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the portions for the singers and the gatekeepers a portion for each day. They also consecrated holy things for the Levites, and the Levites consecrated them for the children of Aaron. Chapter 13, verse 1. On that day they read from the book of Moses, and in hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it was when they had heard the law that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. So here we are continuing where we left off a couple of weeks ago. The celebration, the dedication, the consecration of the walls, the temple, everything that had been accomplished essentially for the past 100 years or so. So hopefully you remember that there were these two choirs that Nehemiah was organizing, and they were quite literally on top of the walls, going from the southern portion to the northern portion where the temple was at strategically, and there they met and continued the celebration. And here it's happening within the same context. It starts off by saying, and at the same time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were doing that literally at the same time, but within that same span of time, generally, they were also offering, giving their tithes, giving their first fruits. This was all part of the celebration. This was also all part of the law, the requirements of the law, not only to maintain the structure of the temple, but also to help out and maintain those who serve the temples, namely the priests, the Levites. So all of these things were done in accordance to God's rules, regulations, but once again, still within this context of celebration, still within this context of dedicating this temple, this wall to God. So I actually don't want to spend too much time on this initial portion because it's essentially pretty straightforward. If we were a church that lacked in tithes, I would spend like 2 hours on this part of this section here. And it's not to say that we cannot learn from that. We should be reminded that part of our celebration and part of our dedication to God is not only singing, it's not only fellowshipping, but it's also giving of the things that God has given us. But once again, I think everybody kind of gets that point. Hopefully, it's something that we all believe in and we all participate in. So the portion of this section that I thought we could spend the majority of our time is actually the one found starting in chapter 13. In chapter 13, we see that a few names of people are mentioned. And actually, before getting to that, I would like to highlight the last verse of chapter 12. And let me read that again. In the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. Now, this is interesting because I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. In chapter 12, we saw Nehemiah speaking in the first person. So if we backtrack a little bit, and let me see if I can find it, on verse 31 of chapter 12, it says, "So I brought the leaders of Judah." And I mentioned that this was significant because we had not seen Nehemiah expressing himself in these terms for a few chapters, since chapter 7. And I've also mentioned that this book, along with Ezra, it is a compiled. Most likely it was compiled and put together by a third party, which is something very normal and usual for the Bible, especially when we're talking about more historical books. So here, this compiler, this editor, utilized the memoirs of Ezra and Nehemiah and other people, put them all together, but also he narrated the story in between those portions of scripture that were literally written and put down on paper by these significant people. So now when we get to chapter 13 or 12 still, but verse 47, when we hear or read, "In the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah," no longer is Nehemiah speaking. I guess he could speak in the third person, and some people do, but Nehemiah does not seem like a type of person who would speak in the third person. In the days of Nehemiah, if I told you, in the days of Raphael, you'd probably think I was a little too full of myself, right? And I still probably am, but I do not speak like that. So here, it is this third party. It's very likely that this compiler now, he is adding to the story just to kind of give an overview of things that are happening, and he picks out two of the main leaders of this whole story. And I've mentioned Zerubbabel, even though he does not get a lot of credit, he was one of the primary leaders of this whole story. Basically, he was Nehemiah prior to Nehemiah. He was the person in charge to manage the building of the temple, and then he left, and now Nehemiah kind of took the reins, and he was supposed to manage the building of the walls. But this narrator, this compiler, now he is giving us this information. He is giving us an overview, and he picks out, look, these are the two main heroes of our story in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah. But guess what? Every time you have a story, a good story, that has heroes, what else do you need? You need villains. Because what's the point of having heroes if you do not have villains? So after mentioning these two main heroes of this story, he goes on to mention some villains. And what we will see in chapter 13 is the narration of villains. Historical villains and certain villains that were more particular to this specific time frame that we are working with. So initially, we're going to talk about these historical villains, but then later on in the chapter, we'll cover that. Next week, we'll cover these other villains that were a little bit more close to their time frame. So who were these villains? We know who the heroes were. Who were these villains? Well, it's stated there right in the beginning of chapter 13. Again, on the day that they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite and no Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God. The Ammonites and the Moabites. Who were these villains? Who were these people? Hopefully, if you think about history, Jewish history, Hebrew history, and you kind of backtrack in the past to the time of Abraham, some of these names come to mind. The Amorites and the Moabites, they were actually pretty closely related to the Hebrews, to the Jews. Specifically, they were in the line of Lot. Who was Lot? Lot was Abraham's nephew. So again, they were cousins, if you will. The Hebrews are Jews, and the Amorites and the Moabites, they were closely related. Now, specifically, who were they? Now, I'm not going to get into the details, so I'll just kind of sum it up very briefly, but I think most of us know the story. Lot eventually had an incestuous relationship with his two daughters. Now, they kind of tricked him, but you have to be very trick-worthy to fall for that. And that's not a word, but I think you know what I mean. You are easily tricked, right? So he had two daughters. He had an older daughter, and he had a younger daughter. The Moabites and the Amorites were fruits of that incestuous relationship. One of the older daughter and one of the younger daughter. So in actuality, they were both his children and grandchildren at the same time. That's kind of how it works. But again, closely related to the Hebrews, to the Jews. Not exactly, but pretty close. And historically, what we see is that God had an expectation for them. He expected these people, eventually they became nations of their own, to be somewhat hospitable and friendly to the Jews. So now if we fast forward to the time period of the Exodus, when Moses was leading the people towards the promised land, the people, the Hebrews, after they had left Egypt, they were traveling around sort of towards the plains of the valleys of the Jordan River. Again, going towards the promised land, getting close to it, and this is where these nations were at. And as the people were crossing over this region to get into the promised land, they did not show hospitality. And instead of hospitality, they actually showed a great deal of hostility. God expected them to provide for the needs of his people, but instead of providing for them, they actually tried to curse them. How do they try to curse them? Well, the king of Moab, and this story is found in Numbers chapter 22 to around 24, he heard about the Hebrews. And he heard about their intentions. Basically, take over Canaan. And obviously, he did not want to succumb to that. So he hired a prophet. And this prophet was named Balaam. Now, Balaam, it's also important to note that he was technically not a false prophet. He was a true prophet. Why? Because he did hear from God. And he did speak the words that he heard from God, but he was a true evil prophet. He was not a godly prophet, even though he was a true prophet. So the king of Moab kind of hired or bribed Balaam, who was a true prophet, to curse the Jews, to curse the Hebrews. And he provided, some things for Balaam, and Balaam said, great, I will do my best. And then several times when Balaam went to curse the Jews, he actually blessed them. I think it was about 3 times. And then finally the king of Moab came to Balaam and said, what gives? You are supposed to curse these people. And several times you've had an opportunity to curse these people. Why do you continue to bless them? And then Balaam said, what am I supposed to do? I cannot do something that God does not want to do. God is forcing me to bless them, and this is all that I can do. And this is the reference that we see here where their intentions were to harm, it was to curse, but God turned that curse into a blessing. So this is kind of the gist of what we have here relating to these enemies, these evil people, countering or balancing. We have heroes, but also we had villains. We have historical villains. Now, when I was reading this portion initially and starting, to study for it, one thing came to mind almost immediately, specifically pertaining to the Moabites. Now, quite literally here, we have a portion of the law, and this is a portion that is being quoted, loosely quoted, but quoted. If you want to turn there, it's Deuteronomy chapter 23. So the context here is that they started reading the law, and then they got to this portion, and then they kind of read it and understood that something needed to be done. So in Deuteronomy chapter 23, I'll read from verse 3. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. So this is essentially what they were referencing as far as what they gleaned from this reading of the law. They needed to make sure that no Moabite or Ammonite would be a part of the assembly of the Lord. But again, I told you, when I read this, something popped into my head. A name, a person immediately came to mind. Do you know who that person is? Ruth. Why did Ruth come to mind? Ruth came to mind because she was a woman from Moab. She was a Moabite or a Moabitess. That's who she was. That was her pedigree. Now, if I just end there, it's not a big deal. But why is this a big deal? Well, it is quite a big deal, because if you go to Matthew chapter 1, around verse 5, we have the genealogy of Jesus. And very few women are mentioned there. But guess one of the few women, it's Ruth. Ruth was the great grandmother of David. That lineage that went all the way to the Messiah. Now talk about being part of the fellowship of the Lord, right? That term or that idea, it's actually kind of generic. What exactly does that mean? Well, we know that if it means anything, it means this. It could mean many things, right? But this is certainly part of it. She is in the direct lineage of the Messiah. So how do you make sense of this? Because the law specifically stated that that was a no-no. And now they were reading the law and trying to abide by these standards. And the compiler, the person who was organizing this story, picked these two historical enemies out to kind of balance the story of the heroes and the enemies and said, look, this is what you should do. Now, there are other practical purposes also that we will see later on in the chapter. But again, out of all of the enemies of the Jews, these two were picked out in this portion of the story. How do you make sense of this? How do you make sense of this exception to the rule? Well, if you glean through commentaries and study materials and articles and whatnot, obviously many people, they make attempts to figure out exactly why this occurred. And some people mention that technically Deuteronomy was focusing on the nation, not individuals from that nation. In other words, God did not want that nation to be a part of his nation, but that did not technically apply to certain individuals of those regions. So that's one way to kind of explain this. Another way to explain it is the curse or this limitation. Usually it followed the males of families and not females. Culturally speaking and religiously speaking, that's kind of how the Jews took this. So if you read commentaries from rabbis, that's more or less what they focus on. Curses and blessings as well, but primarily curses here for our purposes, they followed males. So to marry a female was not a big deal. But if a male Moabite, for example, were to marry a female Hebrew or Jew, then that would be an issue because, again, the important thing was the male and not the female. So that's another way for you to explain this. Another way that I've already mentioned is the vagueness of what this limitation is stating. What does it mean not to be a part of the assembly of God? Does it mean that you cannot inhabit a region? Does it mean that you cannot be a part of the elite or the leadership? Does it mean that you cannot partake in spiritual or religious rites or rituals? What exactly does it mean? Because if it means one thing and it didn't really apply to what Ruth was doing, then there is not an issue. And a couple other things that I could mention, but I think you get the picture, right? There are technicalities that one could hold on to explain how in the world Ruth became such an important figure in the lineage of Jesus. But as I thought longer about this and thought about God, and hopefully I'm thinking about God through all of this, To me, God does not seem like somebody who is affected by technicalities. Sort of like, okay, I made a law. Ooh, but technically, curses only go through males or females, and God's like, oh, okay, you got me. Okay, Ruth can be a part of the assembly of the Lord. Because technically, I did not read the fine, I told oversight. Did not read the footprint, or footnote, not the footprint, footnote. Did not read the footnotes or the fine print. I think I try to put those two terms together. And, okay, you got me. God does not seem to function in those terms. So I was trying to think of a more hearty, theologically meaty reason as to why Ruth became such an important figure in Jesus' lineage, considering the limitations that we have at hand. So if you think about the story of Ruth, it starts off by mentioning Naomi and her husband Elimelech, if I'm not mistaken. And they were Hebrews. They were Jews, but because of a famine, they had to leave their home and go reside in this area where the Moabites lived. And Elimelech, is that his name? Correct me if I'm wrong. And Ruth, or Naomi, they had 2 sons. Now, eventually, Naomi's husband died. So Naomi was left with her 2 sons. And then her 2 sons married women from Moab. One of them being Ruth. So that's how the story goes. Am I right? Okay. Now, the story continues, and all of this is stated within the first few verses of the book, right? This is kind of the background of the book, the foundation, and then the story goes on from there. Eventually, Naomi's 2 sons died. So now, Naomi is left with Ruth and the other daughter-in-law, and just kind of have to figure things out. Now, at that time, Naomi heard that she could go back to her homeland because God had blessed that region and no longer was there a famine. So she could go back to her hometown. So she went to her daughters-in-law and said, look, I'm going to leave. I have nothing, there's nothing for me here. You should stay, find new husbands, and I'm going to go. One of the daughters-in-law said, okay, I'll go. But Ruth said, no. Don't make me leave you. I will go where you go. I will stay where you stay. But not only that, your God will be my God. But considering that relationship, namely, the relationship between Naomi's sons and these 2 Moabite women, I personally believe that it was a sinful relationship. Because again, they were not supposed to mix. Now, they did it because of practical reasons. I'm sure they were in love, so emotional reasons. But that does not change the fact that they did wrong based on the law and the standards of God. Now, we can make, again, any excuse in the world. Fact of the matter is, they were in the wrong. They should not have done it. And here I'm not judging, but they died afterwards. I'm not saying that it is because of this, but I'm just stating facts. They died. But then we see Ruth's posture. And what is Ruth's posture? She was not going to allow her mother-in-law, who, by the way, she had no obligation to care for her, But she was not go allow her mother-in-law to just be stranded on her own, fending for herself. But not only was she showing her dedication to her mother-in-law, she was also showing her dedication to her mother-in-law's God. Your God will be my God. So by that time, when we get that portion of the story, we see that in practical terms, Ruth is a daughter of Abraham by faith. Spiritually speaking, she was no longer a woman of Moab, even though that's where she came from. She was a believer. Spiritually, a true Israelite because she was a daughter of Abraham. Now, when Boaz comes into the picture, he is marrying someone who believes in the God of Abraham, not some foreigner woman who believes in pagan gods. So that unity is a little bit easier to understand. It's easier to digest, even comparing the limitations of the law. So now you have Boaz, who redeems Ruth. You know the story. And God was utilizing that relationship for blessed reasons. Why do I say this? A story that started quite probably with sin. What was the sin? What was the evil? Naomi's sons marrying foreign women, namely women from a region that God specifically had said they are not supposed to be a part of the fellowship of the Lord. Bad, evil, sin. That's how the story started. But now we get a portion of the story, we get to a point of the story where we see blessing, where we see righteousness, where we see a woman who was dedicating herself to the one and only true God, and a man, Boaz, who redeemed her, and God looking at this part of the story as something good and worthy to be a blessing, to the point where he utilized that portion of the story to fulfill his ultimate goal and purposes. What was his ultimate goal and purposes? Pertaining to the Abrahamic covenant, what did God say to Abraham? Which is all part of what we're talking about here. I will curse whoever curses you, and I will bless whoever blesses you. I will turn this relationship between Boaz and Ruth into a blessing. And as an agent, as a tool for my purposes, for my people. And as we think about this story in these terms, this is where we get to that meatier, heartier theological premise or lesson that I was alluding to. Because again, I can rely upon technicalities to kind of explain exceptions to the rules, and those are valid. It doesn't mean that those are not valid, but thinking about it in more theological terms, I think what we see here is an aspect of God's nature. God hates evil. Wouldn't you agree? God despises sin. Wouldn't you also agree? Comma.
God does not hate evil more than he loves good and righteousness. Do you see what I mean? Here's evil. God hates evil. God despises sin. Here's goodness and righteousness. God loves goodness. He is madly in love with righteousness. Both are true. But what we see in the Bible is that even though God hates evil, he does not hate evil more than he loves goodness. And we see it very clearly in a story like Ruth's story. Started with evil, and God hates evil, and he possibly even punished that evil. But he loves goodness and righteousness. Even more so. How does that apply to us? This is the reason why we are not completely consumed on a daily basis. And here I'm talking about believers. I'm not talking about pagans. I'm not talking about people who do not believe in God. I'm talking about Christians. This is the reason why God's mercies are renewed every morning and we are not completely consumed. Do we sin? Do we sin on a daily basis? You betcha. Does God hate evil? Does God hate sin? You betcha. But when God looks at us, there's something more potent than that hatred for sin and evil. He sees righteousness, not our own righteousness. What does he see? Even though he's hating the evil and the sin that abides in us, still, he looks at us. He looks at you, and he looks at me. And he does one of these. He puts on these special glasses. Not these special glasses. He has his own. And they're not reading glasses. They're actually more like sunshades. They have a filter, if you will. God's special glasses. And he notices your sin. And he notices your evil doing. And that just kind of he gets really upset. But he pauses. He counts to 3. And he does one of these. And then he looks at you. But now, do you know what he sees? Because these are specially tinted glasses. He sees Christ. He sees Christ's righteousness in you. And the hatred for sin and evil now is overcome by his love for his one and only begotten Son. The righteousness imputed upon you because of his sacrifice on your behalf. Once again, God hates sin. God hates evil. But he does not hate evil more than he loves goodness and righteousness, which is why we are able to live physically and spiritually, even though till this day we still succumb to sin. Which is why we have this blessed exception to the rule, where Ruth technically was not supposed to be a part of the fellowship of the Lord, yet she became a very essential person in Jesus' lineage. He saw righteousness. He saw goodness. That's the God that we have. Don't mess with God. This is not an excuse to go out and sin and do bad things. But what this does is gives us an insight into his heart and an understanding as to why he deals with us with such grace and love and mercy and compassion. Not because of us, but because he sees Christ in us. And that just overpowers whatever hatred he had because of sin and evil. Amen?